Let's talk about tree productions. Now, on Earth, and who knows, if we go to other planets, we might find new ways that organisms can reproduce. But on Earth, there are two primary ways that organisms reproduce. The first is that, let's say this is some type of unicellular organism, it essentially just make a copy of itself. So that's it there and then that it's copy. And in the two situations, they have identical genetic material. So let's say this is the genetic material on the first one, and this is the first one to begin with, and now you have the second one. Now let's this type of reproduction where one organism by itself can turn into two organisms. This is known as asexual, the asexual reproductions. Another way to interpret the sexual is that it's not sexual. So the next question is, what is asexual reproductions? This is where an organism, or at least cells from two organisms, need to get together in order to produce a third organism. Here's a cell from one of the organism. Let's say that cell is from the mother, it could be an egg cell. Here's a cell from the other organism. Let's call that organism is the father. This will be a sperm cell. And when the egg and the sperm get together, when they fuse together, they have genetic information from both parents, and that new cell can become the offspring. And if sexual reproduction sounds familiar, it's because that's how you came to be. Now, to make this a little bit more tangible, let's look at some cases of asexual reproductions and sexual reproductions. So right over here, we see a diagram of a type of asexual reproductions known as the binary fission. In general, if you hear fission is about splitting something, if people are talking about nuclear fission, they're really talking about splitting of the atom. But binary fission, we're talking about one organism splitting into two organisms, and you can see that you have genetic material. The genetic material interplicates, and the organisms split into two identical organisms, or at least identical from a genetic point of view. Now, the binary fission or split into applies to prokaryotes that we talk about in other videos. There are organisms that don't have organelles, don't have nuclear membrane. They don't tend to have multiple chromosomes. When we talk about eukaryotes, things that do have nuclear membrane, things that have multiple chromosomes, things that have membrane-bound organelles, you have a similar type of reproductions. This right over here, and we'll study it in the depth biology. This is the mitosis, and the mitosis, you can view it as the analog of binary fission, but we're now dealing with eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells are more complex, so this process is more complex, but at a high level, they're both asexual reproductions. In both cases, one cell organism in some cases has turned into two organisms that have the same genetic informations. And it's worth calling out when you take one organism and you produce another organism with the same genetic information. It has a word associated with it, and that is a clone. And you might be familiar with the term clone. From science, fictions move, and they usually use it in a somewhat related context in Star Wars when they talk about the Clone Wars. All of those clones, they all have the same genetic informations as the general informations of the original bounty hunter in Star Wars. They talk about the Clone Wars. All of those clones, they all have the same genetic information as the original bounty hunter from which they were derived. Now, mitosis might also seem familiar to you because this is the most how cells in your body divide, and this is how you grow. This is how you went from being a unicellular organism to being multicellular organism. Now you might be a little bit confused at this point. I just told you that the most of your cells have experienced or are experiencing mitosis, but you're also the outcome of sexual reproductions. But what we'll see in the second is that soon as sexual reproductions occurs, then this newly formed cell right over here through mitosis forms a multicellular organism that the type are you and me, but we also, as we grow and develop, we also produce what we known as gametes that each have half of genetic information. For human being, this will be the egg produced by a female, and this will be the sperm produced by a male. And when they get together, the sperm fertilize the egg, well then they can produce a viable cell that can turn into the offspring. Now, along the illness of binary fission, you have another type of asexual reproduction, in which case a mother cell produces bond of a cell daughter cell. So, like a binary fission, it has to replicate all of its DNA, and then that DNA gets inserted into the daughter cell, but in an end product, you have bigger cell and smaller cell. And we would say that the smaller cell had bonded of this larger one. And so this we call budding, another form of sexual reproductions. When we think about multicellular organisms, there are some typical types of asexual reproductions. For example, the starfish are famous for their ability to form a new organism from a species of an original organism. So let's say you were to cut that part of the starfish from many species of starfish that will then grow into a new starfish. The original starfish will grow that back, and so this type of reproduction is known as fragmentation. It's pretty easy to fragmentation. It's pretty easy to remember. You take a fragment of its and it grows into another organism, and that's how it's reproduced. Now, another fascinating type of reproduction is known as parthenogenesis. That's a fairly word partners, parthenogenesis, and what happened here is you have an organism, and this is a baby Komodo dragon right here that can develop from a unfertilized egg. Remember, in sexual reproductions, we talk about how a sperm from a father organism need to fertilize an egg from a mother organism. And then once they fuse together, then that fertilized egg can go through mitosis to produce a multicellular organism. But in parthenogenesis, you have an egg on its own that's not need to be fertilized, that can turn into a multicellular organism like a baby Komodo dragon. Now you must ask, well, how can this be? Well, sometimes these eggs don't have half the genetic material like we're used to with the eggs from sexual reproductions. For parthenogenesis, many times this egg has a complete set of genetic information. Then it can just go and start doing mitosis and turn to an organism, or there's even situation where the egg does have half the genetic information. Well, talk about this in future videos. This will be an haploid cell. It has half the genetic information of its parent, but the haploid cell in certain cases can develop into a full organism. And there are organisms like Komodo dragon that can reproduce both with the parthenogenesis, which will be an asexual, and certain cases with sexual reproduction. So I'll leave you there. To big categories I'll draw on the dividing line. Here, don't just get confused all the stuff that I draw on the left. It's to the left of this yellow line. These are forms of asexual reproductions, where for the most part one organism can make a copy of itself that has the same genetic information. On the right, we have sexual reproduction when in order to produce a new organism, an egg cell and a sperm cell need to get together. The sperm cell needs to fertilize the egg cell, and each of them would have a simple and half the genetic information from their parents. Now I'll leave you the final question. Always be asking this in biology when we think genetic information from their parents, and each of these